Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. My 3 children stood in my living room with satisfied smirks on their faces as they pushed a 4-page document across my coffee table, presenting it as if they were doing me the greatest favor imaginable. They called it a life agreement. Without bothering to read a single line, I calmly signed it, watching their expressions brighten with what they believed was an early victory. What they failed to realize was that by signing so easily, I had just handed them the very rope they would eventually use to hang themselves. Where are you watching from today? Leave your location in the comments below and don't forget to press the like and subscribe button. But first, let me step back and explain how everything led to that moment, because you are definitely going to want to hear every detail of what happened afterward. Just 7 days earlier, I had buried my husband Robert after 42 years of marriage. Lung cancer took him from me, even though he always insisted he was far too stubborn to die. The funeral was beautiful in its own way. It seemed like half the town had shown up, which is typical in places like Millfield, where people tend to know everyone else's business better than their own. My children Michael, Sarah, and David played their roles perfectly. They looked like grieving children deeply worried about their widowed mother, making sure everyone around them noticed how devoted they appeared to be. Michael even stood up and gave a speech about how family means everything. Under normal circumstances I might have found it touching, but after 3 months of watching Robert slowly waste away, I was so exhausted that the speech almost made me laugh. During the reception I overheard Sarah quietly speaking to her husband, Brad. She leaned toward him and said that their mother looked completely lost, adding that she was worried about me living alone in such a large house. That large house. The same house where Robert and I raised them. The place where Sarah first learned to ride a bike in the driveway. The home where Michael nervously brought his first girlfriend to dinner. The kitchen where David sat studying for his SATs at the table. And suddenly, according to them, the house was far too big. Too much for their poor old mother to manage on her own. The first sign of what was coming appeared 2 days after the funeral. That morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Michael knocked on my door holding coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown. It looked like a thoughtful gesture, except Michael had not brought me coffee since he was about 16 years old and needed to borrow the car. He stepped inside and settled comfortably into Robert's favorite armchair, as if it had always belonged to him. Then he asked how I was holding up after everything that had happened. I told him that I was managing, which was the truth. I had been managing things my entire life. Michael leaned forward with the same serious expression he had inherited from his father, and explained that the managing part was exactly what he wanted to talk about. He said that he, Sarah, and David had been discussing my situation and believed that perhaps I should not have to handle everything alone anymore. Whenever my children started speaking in terms of we instead of I, it usually meant trouble was coming. I told him that I appreciated their concern but assured him that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Michael smoothly interrupted and said that of course I was capable, and that was not the issue at all. According to him, this was simply about family taking care of family members. He said that they wanted to help. There was that word again, help. In my experience, when children suddenly want to help their parents, they are often helping themselves to something. So I asked him what kind of help he had in mind, although by then I was beginning to suspect the answer. Michael pulled out his phone and began reading from what looked like prepared notes. He explained that they had been discussing the practical aspects of my situation. The house required constant upkeep. The yard was enormous. I was dealing with Robert's estate and managing investments. According to him, it was simply too much for one person. I reminded him that his father and I had handled all of that perfectly well for 42 years. Michael replied gently that things were different now because my husband was gone. With a tone that felt almost too gentle, he added that circumstances change and adjustments have to be made. He said they simply did not want me to struggle unnecessarily when there were solutions available. Solutions? That was the second red flag. From my experience, when people start talking about solutions to problems you never complained about, they are usually creating those problems to justify the solutions they already prefer. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived carrying a casserole and wearing the same worried expression Michael had earlier. The following morning David appeared with groceries and repeated almost identical talking points. Suddenly all three of them were extremely interested in my well-being. They asked careful questions about my future plans, my finances, and whether I was truly capable of maintaining the house on my own. By the fourth day, I understood exactly what was happening. They had coordinated the entire intervention like a military operation, taking turns visiting and repeating the same concerns while trying to wear me down with polite worry and helpful suggestions. What they didn't realize was that I had been watching this particular dance unfold ever since Robert's diagnosis became terminal. I knew my children far better than they knew themselves. The final act came on day 7. All three of them arrived together at 6 o'clock in the evening, dressed as if they were attending a business meeting instead of visiting their recently widowed mother. Michael carried a briefcase. Sarah brought a bouquet of flowers that looked suspiciously like an apology. And David wore the most sincere smile he could manage. Michael set the briefcase down on the coffee table with the seriousness of a judge approaching the bench and calmly told me that the three of them believed it was time for a serious conversation. That was the moment they presented their masterpiece, the life agreement. It was 4 pages of legal-sounding nonsense that essentially gave them control over every aspect of my life, while pretending they were rescuing me from myself. Sarah carefully explained that they had been thinking about my future, and that their only goal was to make sure I would remain protected and comfortable as I continued to grow older. I almost laughed at the irony of it all. They were talking about protecting me from the same independence that I had relied on to protect them for their entire lives. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I did something that completely caught them off guard. I signed the agreement immediately. There were no questions, no negotiations, and certainly no dramatic speeches about my independence. I simply picked up the pen that Michael had thoughtfully placed on the table, turned to the last page, and signed my name with the same confident flourish I used decades earlier when signing their school permission slips 30 years ago. The silence that followed felt almost overwhelming. They had prepared themselves for arguments, tears, maybe even a legal fight. What they had not expected was instant surrender from a woman who had never surrendered to anything in her entire life. Michael was the first to recover from the shock. He said that this was wonderful news, though his expression reminded me of a hunter who had carefully prepared a trap for a bear, and somehow ended up catching a butterfly instead. Sarah quickly added that they were all so relieved and insisted that they truly believed this decision was for the best, even though her eyes nervously moved back and forth between her brothers. David simply stared at me as if he were trying to understand whether I had suddenly grown a second head. What my loving children didn't realize, as they exchanged those satisfied glances and began discussing timelines for putting their new plan into action, was that by signing their precious agreement I had actually signed something very different. While they believed they were taking control of my life, I had already begun preparing their education. In my mind, class was about to begin. The very next morning after signing their little agreement, I made a phone call to my lawyer. Not the family attorney, Robert's old golfing friend who would probably run straight to Michael with anything I said, but my lawyer. She was someone I had quietly hired 6 months earlier when Robert's condition became worse and I began preparing for possibilities that my children apparently assumed I was too naive to understand. When my call was answered, I calmly said that I needed to see Catherine Holloway that very day because it was time to move forward with the plan we had previously discussed. Catherine had been recommended to me by my friend Janet. Janet's children had tried something very similar after her husband suffered a stroke. Unlike me, Janet hadn't realized what was happening until it was already too late. By the time she understood their intentions, they had placed her in assisted living and were already in the process of selling her house. Watching what happened to Janet had been an expensive lesson, but that education was about to pay off. During our meeting that afternoon, Catherine asked whether I was absolutely certain that I wanted to move forward. She reminded me that once the process started, it would be very difficult to step back gracefully. I thought about the satisfied look on Michael's face as he watched me sign that agreement. I thought about Sarah's carefully practiced concern and David's polite but calculated kindness. I thought about 42 years of marriage, 3 children raised, countless sacrifices made, and the casual way they had decided my life now belonged under their management. I calmly told Catherine that I was completely certain. If my children wanted to play games, then we would play. Catherine smiled in a way that made it very clear why Janet had recommended her. She was someone who clearly appreciated a well-planned strategic response. The first stage of our plan began immediately. Catherine filed the necessary paperwork to establish a revocable living trust. Most of my assets were quietly transferred into that structure, something my children knew absolutely nothing about. The house they believed was too much responsibility for me was transferred into the trust. Robert's life insurance was redirected. The investments they were so eager to help manage were secured where they could not touch them. But that was only the groundwork. The real masterpiece involved the ranch. You see, my children had never bothered to learn that Robert and I were not just another elderly couple quietly living in a small town in Kansas. 40 years earlier, Robert's uncle had passed away and left us 630 acres of valuable agricultural land just outside Topeka. For decades we had leased that land to local farmers, collecting rent payments that we quietly invested in a portfolio that none of our children even knew existed. At current land values, the ranch alone was worth approximately $2.8 million. The investment portfolio had grown to just over $3.2 million. When everything was added together, the ranch, the investments, the house, Robert's pension, and the rest of our assets, I was looking at roughly $7 million in total wealth. My children, with all their careful calculations, believed they were manipulating a widow who was living on nothing more than Social Security and a life insurance check. The second stage of our plan involved what Catherine liked to call performance art. For several weeks, I would play the role my children expected. I would act like the confused and overwhelmed widow they believed me to be. I would ask them for help with simple tasks, thank them for their guidance, and slowly allow them to believe that they were successfully taking control. Catherine described it as a form of method acting. If they believed they had all the power, they would eventually show exactly who they truly were. The third stage of the plan was the one I personally enjoyed the most: documentation. Every conversation would be recorded. Every decision they attempted to make on my behalf would be documented. Every casual remark they made about my supposed decline would be carefully preserved as evidence. To make that possible, Catherine introduced me to a private investigator named Adrian Cole, a retired police detective who specialized in cases involving financial exploitation within families. "Trust me," Catherine said calmly, "by the time this situation is finished, you will have gathered enough evidence to write an entire book about elder abuse, or at the very least to support a very interesting lawsuit." That same evening, Michael called to discuss the next steps in putting our agreement into action. There was a new tone in his voice, a hint of authority that immediately made my skin crawl. He explained that he and the others had been thinking about the situation with the house. According to him, it might be easier if I temporarily moved in with one of them while they organized everything. I asked him what exactly he meant by organizing things, making sure my voice carried just enough confusion to support the image he clearly wanted to believe. Michael began explaining that there were many decisions to be made about Robert's belongings, the maintenance of the house, and the management of my finances. He said it would be much simpler if I were not distracted by trying to handle everything myself. Simpler for whom, I wondered silently, but I continued playing my role. I told him that the idea made sense and asked which of them he thought would be best. Michael quickly replied that Sarah had the most space in her house. He also pointed out that she stayed home during the day, which meant she could keep an eye on things. Keep an eye on things. As if I were a small child who might stick my finger into an electrical socket if no one was watching. I told him that it was very thoughtful of them and asked when they were thinking about making the move happen. He suggested that the upcoming weekend might be a good time. There was no urgency, he explained, but sooner would probably be better before I became too attached to the routine of living alone. Too attached to my independence, he meant. Too comfortable making my own decisions before they had the chance to convince me that I was no longer capable. I agreed that the weekend sounded perfect. Then I asked whether I should pack all of my belongings or only the essentials for now. Michael quickly suggested that I should bring only the essentials. He assured me that they would gradually handle everything else. Gradually. They were planning to empty my house gradually, selling off 42 years of marriage piece by piece while convincing me it was all being done for my own benefit. After ending the call, I poured myself a glass of the good wine Robert had been saving for a special occasion that never arrived. Then I began making lists. Not packing lists. Strategy lists. Names. Phone numbers. Account details. Legal steps. every possible resource I might need for the quiet war my children had just declared. They believed they were dealing with a grieving widow who would sign anything placed in front of her. What they did not realize was that they had just handed control of their future inheritance to a woman who had spent 42 years quietly managing everything behind the scenes while allowing their father to believe he was the one in charge. Robert used to joke that if I ever decided to try, I could run a Fortune 500 company. What he never quite realized was that I had been running one all along. It was called our family, and the profit margins were about to change in a very interesting way. By Sunday, I would be living under Sarah's roof, playing the grateful mother who needed supervision and guidance. But while they believed they were managing me, I would be gathering information, documenting their real intentions, and preparing for the moment when they discovered just how badly they had underestimated me. The game had begun, and I had already made the first move. Moving into Sarah's house felt very much like walking willingly into enemy territory. But I had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence often comes from behind enemy lines. Her home in suburban Kansas City looked exactly the way I expected it would. Everything seemed designed to impress visitors. Nothing felt designed for comfort. Sarah greeted me with a bright smile and announced that I was welcome to my new home while Brad carried my single suitcase toward the guest room. She placed special emphasis on the word home, as if she were performing an enormous act of generosity. In her mind, she probably was. The guest room itself was pleasant enough. Beige walls, neutral furniture, and the sort of decorations that made it clear the space was meant for temporary visitors. Which was exactly what I was. Although I suspected Sarah imagined this arrangement lasting far longer than I intended, I sat down on the bed and told her that the room was perfect, and that I could not express how much this meant to me. I made sure to sound appropriately overwhelmed. What it truly meant was that I now had a front row seat to observe Sarah and Brad's daily routines, their phone calls, and their dinner table conversations about my future. What they didn't know was that I had arrived with a small advantage courtesy of Adrian Cole. Hidden in my ear was a tiny recording device designed to look exactly like the hearing aid I had started wearing after Robert's funeral. Brad added that they wanted me to feel completely at home. He assured me there would be no schedules and no pressure, only family taking care of family. That phrase again. Family taking care of family. If I heard those words one more time, I might accidentally laugh and ruin the performance I had worked so carefully to create. The first few days were extremely educational. Sarah had apparently appointed herself as my personal case manager. She began scheduling everything from doctor appointments to grocery trips, as if I were helpless rather than a woman who had been managing households since before she was born. On Tuesday morning during breakfast, she proudly announced that she had already arranged an appointment for me with Dr. Peterson on Thursday. It was presented as nothing more than a simple general checkup, supposedly to make sure I was handling the stress well. The doctor Sarah had chosen was Dr. Peterson, not my usual physician. My regular doctor had known me for 20 years, and would probably have been confused by any sudden claims about problems with my mental health. Dr. Peterson, on the other hand, happened to be Brad's golf partner, which meant he might be far more willing to document whatever symptoms Sarah decided I might be showing. "That's very thoughtful," I said while stirring my coffee, wearing the slightly confused expression I had been carefully practicing. I added that I felt fine overall, perhaps just a little scattered, which seemed perfectly normal for someone my age. Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with Brad before responding. She assured me that of course it was normal, but they simply wanted to establish a baseline so they could notice any changes early. Changes. There was that word again, heavy with the suggestion that my mental abilities were slowly slipping away, something that apparently everyone could see except me. Wednesday brought the meeting with the financial advisor. Michael arrived dressed in his best suit, looking very official and carrying a briefcase full of papers that required my signature. David followed with his laptop, ready to guide me through the different accounts and investments they had uncovered in Robert's records. David explained that they had discovered several accounts their father had never mentioned to them, and said there was actually more money than they had originally believed. I leaned forward with polite interest, though my real curiosity was about how much of our financial situation they had actually uncovered. The answer, as it turned out, was disappointingly little. They had found Robert's 401k account, his pension fund, the small savings account we used for monthly expenses, and the life insurance policy. Altogether, they believed the total was around $400,000, which they clearly considered a substantial fortune. What they had not discovered was the ranch, the investment portfolio, or any of the other assets Catherine and I had carefully transferred into the trust. I expressed pleasant surprise and said that was wonderful news, adding just enough amazement to convince them that I had been as unaware of our finances as they believed. I explained that Robert had never discussed money with me, and that I had simply trusted there would always be enough to cover bills and groceries. The look of pure satisfaction that passed between my sons was almost comical. In that moment they believed they had received confirmation of every assumption they had made about their helpless mother, who supposedly knew nothing about financial planning. Michael then opened his briefcase and removed a power of attorney document. He explained that they wanted to consolidate everything into accounts that would be easier for me to understand, with simpler statements and automatic payments. David added that in order to do that they needed me to sign several documents granting them the authority to make changes on my behalf, but only temporarily until everything was properly organized. Temporary. Just like the guest room arrangement. Just like the helpful suggestions about my daily routine. Just like every other temporary step that would quietly become permanent once they held legal control. I looked at the papers as if they were written in hieroglyphics and admitted that it all seemed rather complicated. Michael quickly reassured me that this was exactly why they wanted to handle everything for me. He insisted that I should not have to deal with complicated financial decisions while I was grieving, as if grief had somehow damaged my mind along with my heart. Naturally, I signed the papers just as I had signed their life agreement, wearing the same trusting smile while privately knowing they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating people. What they didn't realize was that the accounts they were so eager to control contained just enough money to cover my basic living expenses for the next 6 months. Catherine had insisted that we leave something for them to discover, something that would feed their confidence while distracting them from searching for anything else. I handed the documents back and told them I felt much better knowing my sons were taking care of everything. The meeting ended with hugs and reassuring promises about how much easier my life was going to be now that I no longer had to worry about complicated matters like managing my own money. Later that evening, after Sarah and Brad had gone to bed, I sat quietly in the guest room and listened to the recordings from the day through the tiny earpiece Adrian had given me. Every conversation, every whispered comment, every moment when they believed I could not hear them. In one recording from the afternoon, Sarah's voice whispered that I seemed more confused than she had expected. She asked Brad whether he had noticed the way I looked at the investment statements as if I had never seen them before. Brad replied that it was probably better that way because it made everything cleaner if I genuinely did not understand what I was signing. Cleaner. As if stealing from your own mother were simply a matter of tidy paperwork and believable excuses. But the most revealing moment happened after my sons had already left. Sarah made a phone call to someone whose voice I didn't recognize and calmly said that yes, she had signed everything. Sarah had said that there were no problems at all. She sounded confident when she explained that things were actually going to be easier than they had expected. According to her, I seemed sincerely grateful that they were helping. Helping. That word was beginning to feel like fingernails scraping across a chalkboard. I connected my phone to Catherine's secure communication application and sent her the audio files from that entire day. Less than an hour later she replied with a short message. Perfect. Phase 2 is ready whenever you are. Phase 2 involves something my children had completely failed to consider. Witnesses. Beginning the next day, I would start making a series of very interesting phone calls to some very interesting people. People who knew exactly what a healthy and capable 73-year-old woman was supposed to sound like. People who might be extremely surprised to hear that I was supposedly confused, helpless, and grateful for someone else managing my life. The situation was escalating, though my children still had no idea they were even involved in a battle. Thursday's appointment with the doctor turned out to be enlightening in ways Sarah had not anticipated. Dr. Peterson was exactly the sort of physician I had hoped to avoid, condescending, impatient, and apparently quite willing to document whatever concerns my daughter had quietly placed in his mind before I arrived. He greeted me by name while barely glancing up from the medical chart as I sat down in the examination chair. Then he explained that Sarah had told him I was experiencing some difficulties adjusting after my husband's passing. Difficulties? That was certainly an interesting way to describe a woman who had knowingly signed legal documents fully aware of what she was doing. I responded carefully and said that I would not describe my situation as difficulties. I explained that I was grieving, of course, but that I was managing. Dr. Peterson scribbled something on the chart. From where I sat, I could clearly see the phrase patient minimizing concerns written upside down in his surprisingly neat handwriting. Sarah quickly added that I had been very forgetful lately. She told him that the day before I could not remember where I had placed my medication, and that morning I had asked about the same appointment twice. That was rather surprising to hear, considering I had intentionally left my blood pressure medication clearly visible on the bathroom counter, and I had mentioned the appointment only once as a small experiment to see whether she was paying attention. Dr. Peterson explained that memory issues were common at my age, especially after a significant loss. Then he finally looked directly at me and asked how I would describe my ability to concentrate. His smile was the kind people usually reserve for small children or frail invalids. I paused for a moment, letting a touch of confusion appear on my face. Then I admitted that sometimes I lost track of conversations, which was technically true. I often lost track of conversations the moment I stopped listening to people who were trying to manipulate me. More notes were written in the chart, and more concerned glances passed between the doctor and my daughter. Dr. Peterson suggested running a few cognitive assessments. He explained that they would be simple tests designed only to establish a baseline for my mental sharpness. Baseline. There was that word again, the exact same word Sarah had used while arranging the appointment. They were quietly creating a paper trail to document my supposed decline. The tests themselves were almost laughably simple. I was asked to count backwards from 100 by sevens. I needed to remember 3 words. I was asked to identify the current president. I intentionally paused during the counting exercise, pretending to lose track once before finishing correctly. When asked about the date, I waited slightly longer than necessary before answering. When the tests were finished, Dr. Peterson admitted that everything looked normal. However, he added that my processing speed might be slightly below average, though still well within the normal range for someone experiencing grief. Slightly below average. I had managed to pass every one of his tests while appearing just confused enough to support Sarah's story without actually failing anything serious enough to trigger real medical concern. Sarah quickly suggested that perhaps I should avoid making major decisions for a while until the grief fog cleared. Grief fog? That was a new phrase. Dr. Peterson nodded seriously and agreed that it was excellent advice. He recommended allowing my family to handle complex matters while I focused on healing. I left the office with a perfectly healthy evaluation that had somehow been twisted into medical justification for treating me like an incapable invalid. Sarah seemed pleased with the outcome, happily talking about how helpful it was to have professional confirmation of what the family had supposedly already noticed. What she didn't know was that I had recorded the entire appointment. Dr. Peterson's casual willingness to support a narrative he had never actually investigated would make for very interesting listening once Catherine reviewed the files. Later that afternoon we had an unexpected visitor. My neighbor Janet arrived carrying a bouquet of flowers, and wearing the kind of determined expression that usually meant something important was about to happen. She walked into Sarah's living room, sat down comfortably as if she owned the place, and immediately announced that we needed to talk. Janet had been my friend for 30 years. Ever since she moved to Millfield after her first divorce. Janet had never been the type of person who worried about politeness when she suspected something wasn't right. She was straightforward, observant, and completely unimpressed by social niceties if she believed someone needed to hear the truth. Sarah asked what Janet wanted to talk about, though there was a tired note in her voice that suggested she already had an idea. Janet didn't hesitate. She explained that people all over town had been talking about how Sarah had moved her mother into her house because she was no longer able to care for herself. Then Janet added that the story sounded strange, considering Helen had seemed perfectly capable of handling her own life the last time she had seen her. For a moment, I felt a wave of gratitude mixed with concern. Janet clearly meant well, but her interference threatened to disrupt the carefully planned role I had been playing. If she convinced Sarah that I was more capable than I appeared, my entire strategy could unravel. So I responded carefully. I told Janet that I appreciated her concern, but the children were simply helping me through a difficult time. Janet snorted at that explanation. She reminded me that I had organized Robert's entire funeral, managed all the estate paperwork, and handled 3 months of medical appointments without missing anything. According to her, it seemed strange that the same woman now supposedly needed help remembering where she had placed her pills. The room suddenly became very quiet. Sarah's face had turned pale, and I could practically see her mind racing as she tried to determine how much Janet actually knew. She finally replied that everyone grieves differently and insisted that her mother had been struggling more than she was willing to admit. Janet looked directly at me and asked whether that was really true. She reminded me that when we had spoken recently about Robert's insurance settlement, I had sounded sharp and completely aware of every detail and every dollar involved. She said that conversation had not sounded like someone who was confused. Insurance settlement. Sarah immediately turned toward me, clearly surprised by information she had never heard before. She asked what insurance settlement Janet was talking about. Janet explained that Robert's employer had provided an additional life insurance policy for long-term employees. She added that I had mentioned it was a pleasant surprise and that the money would ensure I would not have to worry about. I interrupted quickly, suggesting that there was no reason to burden Sarah with unnecessary financial details. But the damage was already done. Sarah's expression changed from confusion to calculation, and I could tell she was already planning to question me about the money she had just learned existed. After Janet left, Sarah wasted no time confronting me about the supposed insurance settlement. She asked directly whether there was money I had not told them about. I allowed my face to show a hint of embarrassment, as though I had been caught hiding something unimportant. Then I explained that it was not a large amount, just a little extra money from Robert's workplace that I had not mentioned because I did not want the children to worry. Sarah immediately asked how much a little extra meant. I pretended to think about it, letting confusion appear on my face once again. Then I admitted that I was not entirely certain because the lawyer handled most of the paperwork. I estimated that it might be around $50,000. $50,000. An amount large enough to sound meaningful but not large enough to completely change their assumptions about my financial situation. Of course, there was no additional insurance settlement at all. The entire story had been Catherine's idea. She suggested planting that piece of information to see how quickly it would travel through the family network. Sarah sat beside me and spoke patiently, explaining that this situation proved exactly why the children needed to be involved in managing my finances. According to her, I could no longer keep track of everything by myself. Couldn't keep track. As if I had not been quietly managing our family's finances for 42 years while Robert received the credit for every smart decision we ever made. Later that evening, I overheard Sarah speaking on the phone with her brothers. She sounded excited, as though she had discovered unexpected treasure. She told them that I had apparently been hiding money. She quickly added that it probably was not intentional, and suggested that I had simply forgotten to mention it. But she also wondered out loud what other assets might exist if $50,000 had slipped my mind. What else indeed? If they were this excited about $50,000, they would be truly shocked when they eventually discovered what I had actually been hiding. But that moment was still several weeks away. Before that could happen, they needed to complete their transformation from concerned children into controlling manipulators. They needed to show their true faces once they believed they had complete power. And I needed to finish documenting every moment of their greed for the audience that would eventually judge them. Because this performance was only just beginning. Watching the transformation unfold was almost fascinating. Within 2 weeks of gaining what they believed was control over my finances, my children changed from concerned sons and daughters into something closer to a corporate board of directors managing every aspect of my life. Michael quickly appointed himself the chief executive officer of my existence. He began calling twice a day to discuss administrative matters, such as whether I needed new clothes, or if my prescription medications should be adjusted. Sarah stepped naturally into the role of social coordinator. She carefully managed my interactions with friends and neighbors, explaining that she wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed by too much stimulation. David took responsibility for household management. He made decisions about everything from which groceries I supposedly needed to what television programs were suitable for me to watch. But the most revealing change was not what they did. It was how they spoke. When talking directly to me, they maintained their carefully constructed image of respectful concern. But when they believed I couldn't hear them, or when they spoke privately with their spouses, the mask slipped entirely. One afternoon I overheard Sarah telling Brad during a phone call that I was far more pliable than she had expected. She even said that she believed I felt relieved not to have to make decisions anymore. Relieved? As if the woman who had spent more than 4 decades quietly making every major decision in our household, while allowing Robert to believe he was in charge, had suddenly forgotten how to choose her own breakfast cereal. Their financial control developed slowly, tightening little by little like a noose. First they moved my checking account to a bank where Michael was listed as a co-signer, for convenience. Then they consolidated my credit cards, closing several accounts I had maintained for years because, according to them, they were unnecessarily complicated for someone in my situation. One afternoon David proudly presented me with a folder explaining my new financial structure. He explained that everything had been simplified. 1 checking account, 1 savings account, and 1 credit card with a reasonable limit. Much easier to keep track of. And, of course, much easier for them to monitor every dollar I spent. The credit card they gave me had a monthly limit of $500. Barely enough for basic necessities, and all the statements were sent directly to Michael's office so he could review them. I asked what had happened to the money from Robert's employer, continuing to play the part of the slightly confused widow who couldn't quite remember financial details. Michael and David exchanged quick glances before answering. Michael explained that they were still looking into the insurance settlement Janet had mentioned. He said there were certain tax implications they needed to research before making the funds available to me. Tax implications? In other words, they were trying to figure out how to gain access to money that did not actually exist while convincing me it was far too complicated for me to understand. But the most revealing moment came during the family dinner Sarah organized to celebrate my successful transition into their care. All 3 children attended with their spouses. My 2 teenage grandchildren, Emma and Jake, were also there, though they looked noticeably uncomfortable listening to the conversation unfolding around them. At one point Michael raised his glass and proposed a toast to their mother for trusting them to take care of everything. Trust. An interesting word coming from someone who was systematically dismantling my independence, while insisting it was for my own good. Sarah added that they were proud of how well I had adapted. She said it took courage to admit when you needed help. Admit when you needed help. As if I had suddenly reached some emotional breakthrough about my limitations rather than simply signing the documents they placed in front of me. But the moment I had been waiting for arrived later, after dinner. The adults moved into the living room while Emma and Jake stayed in the kitchen to clean up. With several glasses of wine loosening their tongues, my children finally stopped pretending. Sarah began talking about the evaluation with Dr. Peterson, explaining that it had been perfect. She said there was nothing actionable in the report, but there was enough documentation to support their position if anyone ever questioned the financial arrangements. If anyone questioned, the way she said it made it clear they had already anticipated possible challenges and were preparing their defense. Michael then explained that the power of attorney gave them everything they needed. He added that I had signed it so willingly that there could be no accusations of coercion or undue influence. Undue influence. A legal phrase someone had clearly researched very carefully before beginning this entire operation. Brad asked about the house, pointing out that it was where the real value was. David replied that they should wait a few more months. He suggested letting me settle into the routine of living with Sarah, and possibly arranging another medical evaluation showing further decline. After that, he said, they could argue that maintaining the house had become too burdensome for me. Too burdensome. The same house I had maintained perfectly for 42 years was suddenly going to be declared too difficult for me to manage. Sarah laughed and said the best part was that I genuinely seemed grateful. She even mentioned that the day before I had thanked her for helping me organize my pill case. My pill case. As if I had not been taking the same 3 medications for 10 years without assistance. Grateful. If they had known what I was truly grateful for, they might have chosen their words more carefully. But the conversation that followed was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. It was the revelation that confirmed everything and justified what I was about to do. Michael explained that once the house was sold and the accounts were liquidated, they would probably end up with around $400,000 after expenses. Split 3 ways, he said, that amount would make a real difference. Sarah immediately began dreaming aloud about what she and Brad could do with their share. She mentioned finally remodeling their kitchen and perhaps taking the European trip they had been talking about for years. David added that he could pay off his boat and possibly upgrade to a larger one. They were already spending my money. They weren't talking about inheriting it someday in the distant future. They were calmly dividing assets they believed were already theirs to control. The house where I had raised them. The savings Robert and I had built over decades of careful planning. The insurance money that came after I watched my husband slowly die. To them, it had all become numbers attached to personal wish lists. But the comment that truly stayed with me, the one that echoed in my mind afterward, came from Michael. He said the best part of the entire situation was that I would never even realize the difference. He added that I was so confused about money that they could tell me the house sold for half its value, and I would simply nod and thank them for taking care of everything. Never know the difference. They genuinely believed they were dealing with a woman so weakened by grief and age that they could rob me completely while convincing me they were doing me a favor. From the kitchen I suddenly heard Emma's voice, quiet but very clear. She asked if they were actually planning to steal their grandmother's house. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Sarah responded sharply and defensively, insisting that they were not stealing anything. She explained that they were simply managing my affairs because I was no longer capable of doing it myself. Jake spoke next, saying that I seemed perfectly fine to him. Hearing that made me feel a surge of pride in my grandson. He pointed out that I had helped him with his history homework the day before, and that I had remembered details about World War II that weren't even in his textbook. Michael dismissed the comment by explaining that long-term memory was different from daily decision-making. Emma quickly challenged that explanation and asked whether he meant the kind of decision-making that allowed them to spend my money on kitchen renovations and boats. The argument that followed was short but intense. Eventually both teenagers were sent to their rooms, and the adults agreed that family matters should be discussed more privately in the future. More privately, because they had just realized that even their own children could see exactly what they were doing. Later that night, lying in Sarah's guest room, I listened again to the recordings from the evening and finally made my decision. The documentation phase was finished. I now had enough evidence of their intentions, their methods, and their complete disregard for my well-being to justify what came next. It was time for phase 3. The following morning I would begin teaching my children the most expensive lesson of their lives. Unlike the education they had received growing up, this one would cost them everything they believed they had already taken from me. Because while they had been planning my future, I had been preparing their reckoning. And their education was about to begin. The next morning I called Catherine and spoke 4 simple words that changed everything. It is time to move. Within 2 hours she arrived at Sarah's house carrying a briefcase. With her came a notary public and the calm smile of someone who knew that a very unpleasant day was about to begin for someone else. Catherine addressed me politely as Sarah reluctantly guided us into the dining room. She explained that she had several documents requiring my immediate attention. Sarah's face turned pale. It was obvious she had hoped to keep me far away from lawyers until their control was fully secure. She asked what kind of documents these were and mentioned that I usually did not deal with legal matters without family present. Catherine calmly explained that they were estate-related matters that required immediate action and could not wait for family discussions. What followed was a perfect demonstration of legal precision. Catherine presented several documents, and I signed each one with the same trusting confusion my children had come to expect. The difference was that these papers were designed to protect me instead of exploiting me. The first document revoked the power of attorney my sons had convinced me to sign. In its place, a new arrangement appointed Catherine as my legal representative. The second document requested a formal competency evaluation, so that any questions about my mental capacity would be handled through proper medical and legal channels, rather than the opinions of golf-playing doctors and manipulative relatives. The third document issued a formal notice that all financial decisions made on my behalf during the past 2 weeks would be reviewed for possible irregularities. Sarah read through the papers, her alarm growing with each line. Finally she asked what all of this meant. Catherine answered politely and explained that it meant my children had decided to take a more active role in managing my own affairs. The temporary arrangements you have put in place are now being reconsidered. The word reconsidered seemed to hang in the room like a quiet threat. Sarah immediately called Michael. He arrived within 30 minutes, looking like someone whose carefully constructed plan had suddenly begun collapsing. He barely acknowledged Catherine when he walked in and directed his attention entirely toward me. He asked what was happening and demanded to know why I was bringing outside lawyers into family matters. Outside lawyers. As though the woman who had spent decades managing the family's interests while he was still learning to tie his shoes could not possibly be trusted to choose her own legal representation. I told him I had been thinking about what he had said earlier, about how complicated everything was becoming. I explained that I had asked Catherine to help me understand the documents I had been signing. The glance that passed between Michael and Sarah was priceless. It was pure panic, barely hidden beneath a thin layer of concern. Sarah quickly insisted that everything had already been taken care of, and that I did not need to worry about legal complications anymore. Catherine calmly interrupted. She explained that Mrs. Mitchell had every right to understand the documents she had signed and the financial arrangements that had been established on her behalf. Financial arrangements. That phrase caused a noticeable twitch in Michael's eye. I could almost see him calculating how much of their plan might become questionable if someone familiar with elder law examined it too closely. He quickly adjusted his tone, switching to his most reasonable voice. He said of course I had rights and that they were not hiding anything. According to him, they were simply trying to protect me from unnecessary stress. Catherine politely asked exactly what they were protecting me from. I could see she was enjoying the conversation almost as much as I was. Sarah explained that they were protecting me from the burden of complicated financial decisions while I was grieving. She added that they wanted to prevent mistakes that might threaten my financial security. Catherine nodded thoughtfully while writing notes and asked who had determined that Mrs. Mitchell was incapable of making those decisions herself. The silence that followed revealed everything. Their entire plan had been built on the assumption that grief and age automatically meant incompetence. Yet they had never actually proven that assumption through proper medical or legal evaluation. Finally Michael spoke again, his patience clearly fading. He said that anyone who spent time with me could see that I was confused, forgetful, and easily overwhelmed. Catherine calmly asked what evidence supported that conclusion. Sarah snapped that she had lived with me for 2 weeks and had personally seen me struggle with simple tasks and forget basic information. Catherine then said she would prefer to hear directly from Mrs. Mitchell. She turned toward me with the kind of professional attention that reminded me exactly who I had always been. A capable adult fully able to manage her own life. She asked whether I had been having difficulty managing my daily affairs. This was the moment I had been preparing for. Weeks of careful performance had led to this point. The role I played now would determine whether my children's education continued exactly as planned. I answered carefully, looking between Catherine and my children with just the right amount of uncertainty. I said that I did not think I was having trouble, though Sarah believed I was. I explained that from my perspective I felt I had been managing fairly well. Michael quickly interrupted, explaining that the problem was that I believed I was managing. According to him, I simply did not recognize my own limitations. Catherine asked me directly what limitations he was referring to. I paused as if thinking, allowing doubt to appear on my face. Then I admitted that they believed I sometimes forgot things and became confused about money. I suggested that perhaps they were right and that maybe I simply was not seeing the problem myself. It was exactly the response I needed. There was just enough uncertainty to support their concerns without actually admitting to any specific example of incompetence. Catherine nodded approvingly. Then she asked whether I would be willing to undergo a full professional evaluation to determine my decision-making capacity, something far more thorough than the brief assessment performed by Dr. Peterson. I said that if it would help everyone feel more comfortable, I would agree. I allowed a small amount of worry to enter my voice and added that I did not want to become a burden to my children if I truly was unable to take care of myself. The trap had been set. My children now faced a choice. They could agree to a proper competency evaluation, which I would pass easily, or they could object and reveal that their entire plan depended on avoiding any real professional examination of my mental condition. After a long pause, Michael said the evaluation seemed unnecessary. He insisted they were not questioning my legal capacity, and that they were simply trying to help me through a difficult period. Catherine responded smoothly that if they truly believed that, then they should have no objection to formally confirming my capacity. And there it was. The exact moment when they had to choose between supporting their story about my supposed incompetence or avoiding the professional evaluation that would expose that story as fiction. Of course we support whatever Mom wants, Sarah finally said. although her tone sounded about as enthusiastic as someone agreeing to a root canal procedure. "Excellent," Catherine replied with visible satisfaction as she gathered her papers. She explained that she would arrange the evaluation with Dr. Evelyn Carter, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in capacity assessments. According to her, the doctor should be able to schedule the appointment within the week. After Catherine left, the atmosphere inside Sarah's house changed almost instantly. The warm display of caring concern disappeared, replaced by nervous tension as my children realized how badly their plans had just been interrupted. Michael sat beside me and spoke with forced calm. He asked whether I understood what I had just done. According to him, I had invited strangers to judge my mental capacity based on only a few hours of testing. Strangers. As if trained medical professionals were somehow less trustworthy than children with clear financial motives. I quietly suggested that perhaps the evaluation would be helpful. If I truly was as confused as they believed, then it would make sense to have that confusion properly documented. The question lingered in the air like an accusation. If I really was incompetent, they should have been eager to have that confirmed by professionals. Their obvious reluctance to pursue a real evaluation said far more about their intentions than any conversation I had recorded. Later that evening, I overheard Sarah speaking on the phone with someone whose voice I did not recognize. Her tone was tight with frustration. She explained that the lawyer had appeared unexpectedly, and that now a full psychiatric evaluation was being arranged. She said they needed to know what their options were if I passed the evaluation. If I passed. Not when I failed, if I passed. Because somewhere deep down they already knew that I was not actually incompetent. They had simply hoped no one would bother verifying their claims. Sarah continued asking about a possible plan B. She pointed out that they had already moved forward with financial arrangements, and that if the evaluation showed I was competent, they might face serious legal trouble. Legal trouble. At last someone was speaking honestly about the consequences of what they had attempted. The rest of the conversation was quieter, but I heard enough to understand that my children had been receiving advice from someone experienced in elder financial exploitation. Someone who had guided them through establishing control over my assets, while maintaining plausible deniability. And now that same person was warning them that they might have acted too quickly and exposed themselves to accusations serious enough to lead to criminal charges. That night, as I lay in Sarah's guest room listening to the muffled sounds of her and Brad arguing about damage control, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced since Robert's funeral. My children had just realized that their victim was fighting back. And the next day they were going to discover something even more unsettling. The person they were fighting had been preparing for this war much longer than they had been planning their theft. Their education was accelerating, and the tuition was about to become far more expensive. Dr. Evelyn Carter turned out to be exactly the professional Catherine had promised. She was thorough, calm, and completely unimpressed by family drama. Her office was designed to feel comfortable rather than intimidating. Because of that, the 3-hour evaluation she conducted felt more like a thoughtful conversation than a medical examination. When we finished the final set of cognitive tests, she explained that she wanted to be completely clear about her findings. Michael and Sarah were waiting outside in the reception area after Dr. Carter had firmly asked them to leave the room when they attempted to influence the evaluation by describing my supposed problems. She had politely explained that family input would be collected separately to prevent contamination of the assessment. Dr. Carter then explained that my cognitive functioning was not only normal for my age but actually above average in several important areas. She said my memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making skills were exactly what she would expect from someone with my education and life experience. Above average. I had performed extremely well on every test she presented, from complex mathematical problems to detailed discussions about current events, financial planning, and legal matters. None of the confusion my children had described appeared anywhere in the results. I asked about the forgetfulness my family had mentioned, continuing to play the role of a concerned patient. Dr. Carter explained that occasional memory lapses connected to grief were normal and temporary. They did not indicate cognitive decline or diminished capacity. She added that losing a spouse after 42 years of marriage represented one of the most profound emotional experiences a person could face. "So I am competent to make my own decisions?" I asked. "Absolutely," Dr. Carter answered without hesitation. She explained that, in her professional opinion, I had full decision-making capacity and was perfectly able to manage my own affairs unless I personally chose to accept help for convenience rather than necessity. Choose to accept help. What an astonishingly revolutionary idea in my current family situation. About an hour later, Catherine, Dr. Carter, and I were seated across from my children in a conference room at Catherine's law office. The formal environment had clearly unsettled Michael and Sarah. Even so, they continued pretending to be concerned children, who simply wanted the best outcome for their mother. Dr. Carter began by summarizing her findings from the report in front of her. She stated clearly that Mrs. Mitchell showed no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or reduced capacity. According to the evaluation, I was fully competent to make financial, legal, and personal decisions. The silence that followed was almost overwhelming. In a matter of seconds, the professional report had dismantled the entire foundation of the plan my children had built. Sarah tried to protest. She insisted that I had seemed very confused lately, that I had forgotten things and often appeared overwhelmed by small decisions. Dr. Carter calmly explained that grief affects people differently. What my family interpreted as confusion could easily have been emotional processing or temporary distraction. She emphasized again that none of it suggested cognitive decline. Michael leaned forward and attempted to sound reasonable. He said they respected the doctor's opinion but pointed out that they lived with me every day and might notice behaviors that a doctor could not observe during a short appointment. His sentence slowly trailed off as he tried to think of a specific example that would not sound manipulative under professional scrutiny. Finally, he said that I had signed documents without reading them carefully and questioned whether I had truly understood what I was signing. Dr. Carter immediately asked whether I had understood the documents. Michael hesitated before admitting that I had. Dr. Carter replied firmly that choosing to sign documents based on trust in family members was a personal decision, not evidence of cognitive impairment. At that exact moment, Catherine opened her briefcase. The real performance was about to begin. Now that Mrs. Mitchell's competency had been professionally confirmed, Catherine explained, it was necessary to examine the financial arrangements that had been made while the family believed she was incapacitated. The phrase financial arrangements visibly unsettled both Michael and Sarah. Catherine reviewed her notes and explained that during the past 2 weeks significant changes had been made to my banking and financial management, without any formal legal documentation proving incapacity. Michael quickly pointed out that I had signed power of attorney documents. Catherine responded calmly that those documents might have been obtained under false pretenses. She explained that if I had signed them based on the belief that I was too confused to manage my own affairs, and medical evaluation now showed I had been fully competent, then every transaction made under that authority could be legally challenged. The impact of those words was immediate. Michael's face turned pale. Sarah clutched her purse as if she were preparing to run. The tension in the room became almost tangible. Sarah insisted that they had acted in good faith, and that they genuinely believed their mother needed help. Catherine asked the same question she had raised earlier. What evidence supported that belief? Michael answered that their conclusions were based on their observations as family members, though his confidence had clearly weakened. Catherine pointed out that those observations had just been contradicted by a professional evaluation, which raised the question of whether the observations had been genuine or merely convenient. Convenient. The word hung in the room like a formal accusation. Sarah demanded to know what Catherine was implying. Catherine smiled slightly, and I recognized the expression of a lawyer preparing to deliver a devastating argument. She explained that every financial transaction made under the disputed power of attorney would now be reviewed. That included every account closure, every transfer of funds, and every decision made on Mrs. Mitchell's behalf. If any of those actions had benefited family members while disadvantaging Mrs. Mitchell, Catherine explained, they would be filing criminal charges for elder financial abuse. Criminal charges. The phrase that had been quietly hovering beneath this entire confrontation was finally spoken aloud. Michael tried to protest, asking whether she was serious. Catherine calmly explained that elder financial exploitation was considered a felony in Kansas. She added that the penalties could include significant fines, restitution, and even prison time. In fact, when the offenders were family members, the law treated that circumstance as an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one. I watched the expressions on my children's faces as the reality of their situation finally began to settle in. My children had clearly expected that if their scheme ever came to light, the worst consequence would be family disappointment, perhaps some angry arguments or a period of awkward silence between us. What they had not anticipated was the possibility of federal investigators and criminal prosecution. Sarah quickly insisted that they had not stolen anything. She claimed that everything they had done was simply an attempt to help. Catherine calmly asked whether that help involved taking control of assets they assumed they would eventually inherit. She continued by asking if helping also meant making financial decisions that conveniently benefited their own situations. Finally, she asked whether helping included isolating Mrs. Mitchell from independent legal counsel until this very day. Each question struck with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, exposing different pieces of behavior that looked increasingly deliberate once examined under legal scrutiny. Dr. Carter then turned toward me with professional courtesy. Since my competency had been officially confirmed, she asked what I would like to do about the arrangements my family had created. This was the moment I had been preparing for. For weeks I had played the role of the confused victim. Now it was time to reveal how much control I had never truly lost. I said carefully that I wanted to review everything. I explained that I needed to understand every decision that had been made and determine whether those choices had truly served my interests, or simply the convenience of everyone else. The word everything was about to become very expensive for my children, because Catherine and I were only beginning their education, and the next lesson would show them exactly how costly it was to underestimate the woman who raised them. The financial review that followed resembled watching a carefully constructed house of lies collapse piece by piece. Catherine had invited a forensic accountant named Adrian Lynn. With the patience and precision of someone performing an IRS audit, he began examining every transaction my children had authorized during the 2 weeks they believed they controlled my finances. Adrian opened the bank records on his laptop while we sat in Catherine's conference room. He explained that the power of attorney had been signed on a Monday. By Wednesday, $15,000 had already been transferred from my money market account to what appeared to be a credit card payment. $15,000. Money that had nothing to do with my care or well-being. Michael immediately tried to explain that the payment had been made for my benefit. According to him, they had consolidated my credit cards to simplify my financial management. Adrian calmly asked whether those credit cards happened to be in Jennifer's name, Michael's wife. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Michael's face changed from pale to bright red as he realized their financial maneuvering was being revealed with professional accuracy. Sarah weakly suggested that there must have been some mistake. Adrian calmly confirmed there was no mistake. He explained that there had actually been 3 separate credit card payments totaling $18,000. Every one of those payments had gone to accounts belonging to family members rather than to me. $18,000. Nearly half of the money they had discovered in Robert's accounts had already been used to eliminate their personal debts, while they continued claiming they were simplifying my finances. Adrian then pointed out something even more revealing: the timing of the transactions. All of the payments were made immediately after they gained financial control. That pattern strongly suggested these decisions had been planned in advance rather than being spontaneous actions taken for my benefit. Planned. That single word changed everything. What might have looked like misguided assistance now appeared to be calculated theft, and everyone in the room understood the difference. Catherine calmly took out a legal pad and began writing notes with the steady precision of someone building a criminal case. She asked Adrian to continue reviewing the remaining transactions. What followed was a detailed breakdown of financial exploitation disguised as family assistance. My children had not merely paid off a few debts. They had systematically redirected my financial resources to benefit themselves, while maintaining the illusion that they were protecting me. Adrian pointed out a $5,000 transfer sent to David Mitchell's business account. The transaction was labeled as a household management consulting fee. Household management consulting. David had literally paid himself $5,000 for the privilege of controlling my finances. To justify it, he had created an official-looking invoice for services I had never requested. Adrian then revealed another transaction: a $3,000 payment sent to Sarah Bradley under the description Residential Care Coordination. $3,000. Apparently that was the price they assigned to allowing me to sleep in her guest room for 2 weeks, while she monitored my conversations and restricted my contact with the outside world. Adrian then summarized the total. Over the course of 2 weeks, $31,000 had been redirected from my accounts directly into the hands of family members. That amount represented nearly 80% of the liquid assets they had discovered. $31,000 in 2 weeks. If I had truly been the confused widow they imagined, they would have taken nearly everything I had while convincing me they were doing me a favor. Catherine explained calmly that the pattern of transactions represented clear evidence of financial elder abuse. The records demonstrated deliberate exploitation of someone they believed to be vulnerable for their own financial gain. Michael finally spoke again, though his voice sounded tight with desperation. He insisted they had always intended to pay the money back, and claimed the transfers were temporary loans meant to stabilize their finances, so they could better care for me. Temporary loans. Loans taken without my knowledge, without my permission, and without any written agreement. In simpler terms, theft with a more attractive label. Catherine calmly reminded him that loans require the consent of the person lending the money. Then she asked me directly whether I had authorized any of the transactions Adrian had identified. I answered simply that I had not. I explained that I had never known they were taking money for themselves. My statement fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending waves of legal consequences outward. Catherine finally said that she believed the review had revealed enough. She began gathering her materials while explaining that Adrian would prepare a full written analysis to accompany the criminal referral. Criminal referral. That was the phrase that finally caused Sarah to break completely. She began pleading, tears running down her face, saying they could return everything with interest and insisting they had never intended for things to go this far. I asked her quietly how far she had actually intended it to go. It was the first time I had addressed her directly since the meeting began. She looked at me like someone who had suddenly realized she was trapped in something far more serious than a simple family disagreement. She tried to explain that she knew how everything appeared, but insisted they had genuinely believed they were helping. Helping. By taking my money. By controlling my affairs so I would not have to worry about them, all while quietly taking $31,000 for themselves. Her expression collapsed as the reality finally reached her. This was no longer about losing access to my finances. They were facing charges that could damage their reputations, destroy their careers, and take away their freedom. Catherine then turned to me with professional respect and explained that I had several options moving forward. I could pursue criminal charges, seek civil recovery, or negotiate a restitution agreement that might prevent prosecution in exchange for full repayment and additional conditions. Additional conditions. I found that phrase particularly interesting, because I had already begun forming those conditions in my mind. I said I needed time to think, continuing to play the role of a mother struggling with the decision of whether to ruin her own children's lives. Catherine agreed and told me to take all the time I needed. In the meantime, she assured me that my financial accounts would be secured, and that no further unauthorized transactions would be allowed. As we left the meeting, my children looked completely shaken. They appeared like people who had just survived a disaster, slowly realizing that everything they thought they controlled had been taken away. But they still had no idea what was coming next. Because while Catherine and Adrian had been exposing the money they had already taken, I had been preparing to reveal something far more significant. The money they had never even known existed. The ranch. The investment portfolio. The carefully hidden assets that would transform this situation from a case involving a modest widow into something much larger. Phase 4 was about to begin, and my children were about to learn that their attempt to take $400,000 had placed them at risk of losing access to nearly $7 million. Their education was accelerating, and the final lesson was going to be devastating. 3 days later, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Michael, Sarah, and David and asked them to meet me at the house, the same family home they had been so eager to sell for my supposed benefit. When they arrived, they found me sitting in Robert's favorite chair. Catherine was there, along with Adrian Lynn and a woman they did not recognize. Sarah asked nervously what was happening, clearly unsettled by the formal atmosphere I had created. I told them that I had made decisions about how to handle what they had done. My voice carried a firmness they had not heard since they were children being corrected for lying. The unfamiliar woman stepped forward and introduced herself as Detective Maria Navarro from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. She explained that she specialized in financial crimes involving elderly victims. The color drained from all three of their faces at once. A detective? At that moment, this stopped being a family issue or even a civil dispute. It became a criminal investigation. Detective Navarro explained that Mrs. Mitchell had provided extensive documentation of financial exploitation. She presented a thick file containing recorded conversations, bank statements, and Adrian's detailed financial analysis. Michael quickly said they were willing to cooperate and insisted they had already agreed to repay everything. The detective calmly explained that financial elder abuse in Kansas is classified as a Class C felony. She added that the amount involved, the family relationship, and the structured nature of the actions all made the case more serious. She made it clear that this was not something that could be resolved simply by paying the money back. Systematic behavior. That phrase settled heavily over the room as the full weight of their situation became clear. This was not being treated as a misunderstanding. It was being treated as an organized criminal act. Catherine then added that Mrs. Mitchell was willing to consider alternatives to criminal prosecution, but only under very specific conditions. Specific conditions. My children's expressions shifted instantly, desperate hope appearing as they realized there might still be a way to avoid charges. David asked what those conditions would be. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the garden where I had spent decades building the life they had tried to dismantle. Then I turned back toward them. First, I said I wanted a full accounting not only of what they had already taken but everything they had planned to take. Every conversation, every idea, every assumption they had made about me. Sarah tried to interrupt, but I stopped her immediately. I told her I was not finished. Second, I explained that I expected written apologies. Not excuses, not justifications, but clear admissions of what they had done and why it was wrong. The room fell completely silent as they understood I was demanding written confessions. Then I continued with the final condition. I said I wanted them to fully understand exactly what they had tried to steal from me. I gave Catherine a small nod. She opened a legal folder that was far thicker than anything they had seen before and addressed the room formally. She asked whether Mrs. Mitchell would like to explain to her children what their investigation into her finances had failed to uncover. This was the moment I had been preparing for over months. The revelation that would turn their actions from a simple act of greed into a catastrophic miscalculation. You found $400,000, I said calmly, reminding them of Robert's 401k. His pension, the life insurance, and our basic savings. I told them they believed that was everything. Michael gave a slow, tired nod, clearly unsure where this was going. I told them simply that they were wrong. Catherine opened the folder and began placing documents on the table, each one revealing a completely different financial reality. Property deeds, investment statements, trust records, and business agreements. All evidence of assets my children had never imagined existed. She explained that their mother owned 630 acres of prime agricultural land outside Topeka, with a current market value of approximately $2.8 million. The silence that followed was absolute. My children stared at the documents as if they were written in a language they could not understand. Catherine continued, explaining that I also maintained an investment portfolio that had been growing for 40 years, now valued at approximately $3.2 million. $6 million. When combined with the house and the other assets they already knew about, the total estate reached nearly $7 million. Sarah spoke softly, clearly shaken. She said that I had acted as if I were worried about money, and that it seemed like Robert's death had left me struggling. I corrected her immediately. I explained that I had never said I was struggling. They had simply assumed that because they believed I was too incapable of managing substantial wealth. The truth struck them hard. They had not been taking advantage of a confused widow with modest means. They had been attempting to exploit someone whose wealth far exceeded anything they had imagined. Michael asked quietly why I had never told them. I explained that I wanted to see what they would do when they believed I was vulnerable. I wanted to understand who my children truly were when they thought they could take advantage of me without consequences. David was the first to fully grasp what this meant. He began to say that if they had succeeded in controlling my finances, they would eventually have discovered assets worth millions instead of thousands. I finished that thought for him. explaining that their actions would have escalated as they uncovered more. Detective Navarro nodded and explained that this revelation strengthened the case significantly. It showed that their actions were limited only by what they knew about my assets, not by any moral restraint. Limited only by what they knew. In other words, they would have taken everything they could find. I returned to my chair and explained calmly what would happen next. They had two choices. They could face criminal prosecution, which would include felony charges, possible prison time, and complete public exposure. Sarah asked desperately if there was another option. I told her there was. They could accept my alternative, which included very specific conditions designed to ensure they would never forget the lesson they had just learned. Catherine placed another set of documents on the table. She explained that I was willing to drop criminal charges under certain conditions. Those conditions included full repayment of the money they had taken, along with an additional 20% penalty. They would also be required to publish public apology letters in the Millfield newspaper acknowledging what they had done. In addition, they would be permanently removed from any future inheritance or financial support. Complete removal. They would repay everything, publicly admit their actions, and lose access to the very wealth they had tried to take. I added one final condition. Each of them would contribute $50,000 to a scholarship fund for victims of elder financial abuse, ensuring they understood that the harm they caused extended beyond just our family. That meant $150,000 in contributions along with repayment, penalties, public humiliation, and permanent disinheritance. The cost of their greed now far exceeded anything they had hoped to gain. Detective Navarro calmly added that the alternative remained criminal prosecution for systematic financial elder abuse, which could result in sentences of up to 5 years in prison and permanent criminal records. My children sat in stunned silence, trying to process how quickly their lives had been transformed from comfort to potential ruin. I told them they had 24 hours to decide. After that, the offer would expire, and Detective Navarro would proceed with criminal charges. As they walked out of the house they had planned to sell out from under me, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced since Robert's death. My children had tried to take my independence, my dignity, and my financial security, all while convincing themselves that they were helping me. The next day, they would finally understand that their lesson, and its consequences, were only just beginning. 23 hours later, all 3 of my children sat inside Catherine's office, signing the most expensive documents of their lives. Michael's hand trembled as he signed the restitution agreement. Sarah cried openly while writing her public apology. David stared at the scholarship fund commitment as though the numbers in front of him could not possibly be real. Catherine finalized the paperwork and explained that the total financial impact for the 3 of them would be $231,000, along with public admissions of attempted theft and permanent removal from Mrs. Mitchell's estate. $231,000. The price of trying to take from someone they believed was too old and too confused to fight back. But the financial cost was only the beginning of their education. I told them there was one more thing as they prepared to leave the office, defeated and humiliated. They turned back slowly, their faces showing exhaustion and disbelief after everything that had already happened. Then I told them quietly that I was not actually keeping their inheritance. The statement hit them like a shock. Sarah's tear-streaked face went completely blank. Michael stared at me as if he did not understand the language I was speaking, and David looked as though he had forgotten how to respond. Sarah finally managed to ask what I meant. I explained that I was not keeping their inheritance. Despite everything they had done, they were still my children and I still loved them. Catherine raised an eyebrow slightly, though we had already discussed this possibility. I explained that the harshest lesson for people driven by greed is not losing money, but realizing they never needed to steal in the first place. Michael spoke slowly, pointing out that the agreement they had just signed stated they were excluded from my estate. I confirmed that was correct, but I clarified that the estate itself would still benefit their children and future generations in ways that served the family better than individual greed ever could. I then presented a folder I had prepared for this exact moment. Inside were the plans I had been building while they were busy planning how to take from me. I explained that Emma and Jake would each receive full college scholarships funded through a trust one had established. Their grandchildren would be able to pursue education without the burden of student debt, though their parents would have no control over those funds. I continued by explaining that the ranch would be transformed into a family agricultural operation, managed by a board of trustees. It would generate income for family members who contributed honestly through work, not through manipulation. Then I described what would happen to the house. It would become a family retreat, preserved through the trust and available for gatherings, ensuring it remained part of the family without becoming a source of conflict. Everything I described was exactly what they could have had if they had simply come to me and spoken honestly instead of trying to take from me. Financial stability, long-term family wealth, preservation of everything we had built together. David quietly asked why I would do this. I explained that the purpose of everything that had happened was not revenge. It was education. They needed to understand what it felt like to be vulnerable to people they trusted. They needed to learn the real consequences of betraying family. And they needed to see that cooperation always works better than exploitation. Sarah, still crying, said that they had tried to steal from me. I agreed that they had. And I told them they had already paid a very high price for that choice. But they were still my children, and children must be taught, not only punished. Catherine watched silently as emotions moved across their faces. Shame, relief, gratitude, and the slow realization that this had been a lesson, not simply an act of revenge. Then I explained one final condition written into the trust. If any of them ever attempted to manipulate or financially exploit an elderly person again, their families would permanently lose access to everything within the trust. This was their only second chance. A warning wrapped inside forgiveness. Michael finally asked how long I had been planning all of this. I answered honestly. I told him it began the moment they started treating me as if I were incapable. The moment they decided I was too old and too confused to manage my own life was the moment I began preparing to show them exactly how capable I still was. Sarah apologized again, but this time her voice sounded genuine. I told her that I believed her. But I also made it clear that an apology alone was no longer enough. Sorry no longer changes what you chose to do. It only proves you finally understand it. From that moment forward, I made it clear that our family relationships would stand on three things only: respect, honesty, and cooperation. Anyone unwilling to meet those expectations would no longer be part of this family in any meaningful way. As my children walked out of Catherine's office, financially shaken but still part of my life, I felt a sense of peace I had not experienced since Robert passed away. I had protected myself, taught them a lesson they would never forget, and secured our family's future in a way that ensured no one would ever be placed in that position again. 3 months later, I stood in the community garden I had created on part of the ranch, watching Emma and Jake planting vegetables alongside their parents. The scholarship fund had grown far beyond what I originally contributed. It was now helping dozens of elderly abuse victims, while also educating my own family about the importance of protecting those who are vulnerable. Michael had taken on a part-time role managing the ranch operations. He was learning the agricultural business while slowly rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect. Sarah had become a volunteer advocate for elderly rights, using her organizational skills to protect others instead of taking advantage of them. David had turned his experience into something meaningful as well, establishing the Family Retreat Center and creating a place where future generations could gather without conflict over ownership. My autobiography, Never Too Old to Fight Back, became a bestseller among older women. It offered both an engaging story and practical guidance for anyone facing financial exploitation within their own family. The proceeds were used to expand the scholarship program and help create similar support systems across Kansas. But the moment that meant the most to me came during our first family gathering at the retreat center. Emma approached me with a thoughtful expression and told me she wanted to study elder law when she went to college. She explained that she wanted to help people who were strong enough to fight back, as well as those who were not. My granddaughter had chosen a path dedicated to protecting people from the very kind of actions her own parents had once taken. That was when I knew the lesson had truly taken hold. Not just with my children but with the next generation. I told her it was a wonderful choice and promised that when she graduated, there would be a place waiting for her in the family foundation we were building to fight elder abuse across the country. As I watched my family working together in the garden, I understood something important. The greatest gift you can give your children is not money or property. It is the kind of education that teaches them to value people over profit, relationships over exploitation, and integrity over easy gain. My children had tried to take my independence, and instead they discovered that I was strong enough to reshape their entire world while guiding them toward becoming better people. It had been the most expensive lesson they would ever learn, but it was also the most valuable. And every time I looked at the ranch they never knew about, the investments they never discovered, and the trust that would protect our family for generations, I was reminded of one simple truth. Sometimes the best way to defend yourself from being underestimated is to let people underestimate you. Right up until the moment you prove them wrong. The lesson was over. The learning would last forever. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.